had all run away from Los Angeles, partly because we were all ex-film students, and to be a film student at that time was to have a little mark of Cain on your forehead, that you were not welcome.
And we decided that San Francisco would be a great place to start a little film company, and that we would outfit it with young, adventurous directors, and we would do alternative kinds of films. There was an idea that we could do something different than what was being done in Hollywood.
Back then, it was very hard to get into the business. The business itself was, some people believed that it was the end of movies as we knew it.
There had been some big failures of films that had traditionally been very successful, like, The Sound of Music was one of the, thought to be the biggest, most successful film made at the time, and then they made another film with the same team called Star, and no one came to see it.
It was a period of extraordinary change. I've never seen public taste change as quickly.
In fact, 1969 or 1970 was the year of lowest movie attendance ever. David Niven has written, we would look back in the future, we would look back on going to the movies the way we look back now on vaudeville. That it was a peculiar social situation that happened for a 50 or 60 year period, and then it died out because of television.
In the 30s, 40s, and 50s, Paramount was one of the great legendary studios, great stars. But by the time you get to the 1960s, it really was the bottom of the top 8.
Would you believe that Paramount was bought, 5 years before The Godfather was made? The entire studio was bought for $600,000.
Charlie Bluedorn was the head of Gulf Western, which was a giant conglomerate who had bought Paramount. He was a very dynamic entrepreneur, buying and selling companies and countries and God knows what all.
Mel Brooks' film, Silent Movie, was all about what was going on in Hollywood at the time, because it's about an old-time Hollywood studio that was bought out by a conglomerate called Engulf and Devour, which is clearly a reference to Gulf and Western. Engulf and Devour were these scary guys in a boardroom in New York City who were heartless and not interested in any kind of creativity and not really even interested in movies. In fact, they were thinking of just selling off the real estate just to turn a profit.
Charlie told me they're going to close the studio down. I said, give me a chance to go and make a presentation to the board.
Good afternoon. My name is Robert Evans, and I'm Senior Vice President of Paramount Pictures. My job at Paramount is to oversee our productions around the world. These past few years have been rough for Hollywood. We've made a lot of mistakes.
Paramount needed a hit, obviously, and they got a hit, by the way, in Love Story. Love Story was a very important film for Paramount.
It's the first time in motion picture history that a picture is being released while the book is still the #1 book in the nation. I think Love Story is going to bring the people back into the theater in droves. I could go on for an hour and tell you about 20 or 30 projects that are in various stages of development and bore you with it. So I won't. But I want to bring up one project, and that's The Godfather. To bring up the similarity between The Godfather and Love Story, which are the two biggest books of the last decade. We developed both of these books, spurring the writers on to make these books what we think will be the great movies they're going to be.
Well, the book came out and it made its own history, but distribution at Paramount did not want to make it.
In your wildest imagination, could you ever fathom developing a 30-page treatment into the biggest novel of the decade, and the distribution mavens don't want to make it? Sicilian mobster films don't play. That's what these distribution guys had to say. Look at The Brotherhood, a perfect example. Kirk Douglas, an all-star cast, terrific reviews. It didn't even have a first weekend business. Outside of red ink, every one of the films shared another thing in common. They were written, directed, and produced, and usually starred Jews, not Sicilians.
See, police! He's a take at his club, and he's a play with it just like a cop. I know.
And what made matters worse, one director after another turned it down. Here I sit controlling the biggest book in the world, yet my company won't make it, and I can't find a fucking maestro to direct it. Richard Brooks, Costa Gravas, Elia Kazan, Arthur Penn, they all turned it down.
A lot of directors said, interesting book, a little trashy, and it glamorizes the mafia. Bad subject.
Francis happened to have been really new in the business. He only made 3 films, but he was Italian, and he didn't even want to make the picture.
You know, I was hoping it was going to be some sort of intellectual film about power and succession. And in fact, it was more sort of pseudo-Hollywood Frank Sinatra stories, and the woman with who needed an operation of her private parts and stuff that I thought was sleazy.
Zoetrope Studios in San Francisco was in a terrible financial crisis at the time. I remember discussions around the espresso machine about whether Francis should take the job or not, because it's exactly the kind of job, on one hand, that he was running away from. He wanted to make small personal movies, European-type movies, and here was Hollywood at, in a sense, it's Hollywoodiest for the reasons that those other guys had turned it down, trying to grab him back.
As things got sort of grimmer and grimmer on the American Zoetrope front, I started encouraging Francis to think about our survival more than anything else. Time had come for us to get into lifeboats, and basically this Godfather idea was a lifeboat.
Remember George Lucas saying, just take the job, do it, do whatever they want, and just get the money, and then we can do what we want to do. And Francis was in agony over that.
I thought I was going to really
Yet he had to admit that there was something compelling about it.
After 3 long days of discussion with this guy, Peter comes into my office. Coppola will make the picture on one condition, that it's not a film about organized gangsters. It's not about organized gangsters. It ain't a musical, Peter. He has an idea, heavens, that's not bad. He wants to make it as a family chronicle, a metaphor for capitalism in America. This is nuts, Peter. I don't like it. I just don't like it. Peter shook his head, laughed. Let's not forget he's
would cast somebody small and dark and very Italian looking. In fact, an Italian seemed to the studio to be completely mysterious.
Paramount wanted to save money, and so one of the things they wanted to do was to not film it as a period piece in 1946, but instead to bring it up to the 1970s, make it contemporary, because that would be cheaper to, shoot in the contemporary style. Also, they wanted not to shoot in New York. They wanted to shoot it in St. Louis because it would be cheaper. Again,
Francis ran headlong into that maelstrom, which was quite a bit worse than any of us could have imagined. It was just simply a conflict between them wanting to do a kind of low-budget pop boiler, get it out, cash in on the popularity of the book, and Francis wanting to make something meaningful about Italian Americans and the mafia and, family.
He had a kind of Jedi mind trick, I think, to convince the studio that what they absolutely did not want was, in fact, the best idea. And they went along with all of these, and eventually Francis...
The studio, as they were seeing the dailies, were horrified. Not only, they were horrified with everything. They didn't like Brando. They thought he mumbled. They thought it was much too dark. I wasn't moving the camera.
Francis had to fight every day to get his vision on the screen. It didn't come easy.
I went and visited him on the set where he'd thrown the phones through the doors, or fists through the door and phones across the room, and they had the phones all lined up. They had the door sitting there, all of his outrage, and I knew that there were various people on the crew trying to take over the production.
The man in charge of production didn't feel Coppola was competent. And it was true that someone was being warmed up in the wings to substitute for Francis.
Francis could work under battle conditions or under conditions of peace. I suspect that his best work comes when he's under the gun.
The scene where Michael kills Sollozzo and McCluskey is a pivotal scene for all kinds of reasons. It was also the scene that, when Francis was shooting the film, prevented Francis from actually being fired off the film. The feeling up to that point was, what is this movie? It's not turning out the way we thought it would, whatever that was. But when that scene, Francis's cut of that scene, was seen by the head of the corporation, then all the pressure that was on Francis disappeared.
When the picture opened, the night it opened, to the Low State Theater in New York, Henry Kissinger said to me, you know, Bob, here's a man who's a killer, a gangster, who's killed hundreds of people. And yet when he dies, those people in the audience are all crying. That's touching greatness. And this man, Coppola, has touched greatness.
I came out on a Wednesday, I remember. I had just turned 15, and I told my father, who was out of work, I said, Dad, it's opening. And because I had been reading about it. I was a big movie fan, and all of us were big movie fans in the house. So we went on Saturday. We waited on line a long time. The lines were all the way around the block. And I remember I was just mesmerized.
I believe in America. America has made my fortune.
I think anyone who saw the movie that day or that week knew that they saw something quite extraordinary. I was dazzled by it. It's like, you know, Shakespeare.
She kept her honor. So they beat her like an animal.
I was pulverized by the story and by just the cumulative effect the film had on me. And I also felt that I should quit, that there was no reason to continue directing because I would never achieve that level of confidence and the ability to tell a story, such as the one I had just experienced. So in a way, it shattered my confidence.
It was a celebration for people from my background when we saw it. We were like, oh, wow, there we are. But then are we that? We're not that, you know.
I think there's no doubt that Coppola, being an Italian steeped in that culture, it's in every frame of that movie. The opening scene of Connie's wedding, the documentary footage of the mother, you know, or of them dancing and of them singing. I don't think that somebody who wasn't steeped in the culture could possibly have been that attentive to the kind of detail that it requires to set up the shots, to get it in a documentary style.
A lot of these wide shots, you know, where you got so many people, so many things going on, and it's kind of extras, not quite, you know, there's things about it that aren't perfect. I don't know whether it was intentional or not, but a lot of those things are just left in, but it makes it feel more real.
I didn't grow up in a household that was movie savvy at all. People didn't watch films. My father's Italian and my mother's Jewish. It's, you know, and those two cultures are very similar. But everything, even like Sonny, when he gets upset and he's like biting his hand, you know what I mean? There's just like I've seen it with my, you know, male Italian relatives.
It was the same gestures, it was the same, the family life was the same, it was the same high level of tension and operatic behavior in the family. Probably not supposed to say this, but I had a problem because Marlon Brando wasn't Italian and James Caan wasn't Italian. Maybe that's why James Caan and Brando sort of stuck out for me, because the rest of it seemed, I felt like I was seeing my family for the first time. Soon after that was Mean Streets, which was even more realistic.
I don't think of them as gangster movies. I think of them as Italian family movies, because that's the level that I related to the film. It's got nothing to do with the occupation. It's got nothing to do with the good and evil aspects of what these people did for a living. But in terms of the family structure and the relationships and the food that they ate and the songs that they sang and the behavior that they had.
I don't think that you had the level of detail around family, actually probably in any movie, but particularly in a gangster movie.
It's a saga. Again, I think it's that the family aspect lends itself toward that because that's the thing that everybody relates to.
How's the baby?
You know, that's what makes you care.
Sleeping inside me?
Does it feel like a boy?
Yes. Yes, it does, Michael.
It's family drama at its best. Scenes of like the big parties and the dysfunction where somebody's too drunk and like saying something that they shouldn't, the fights that break out, or, you know, that kind of thing. The culture made sense to me.
You see?
I mean, when you got a scene where you've got, you know, Clemenza stirring the meat, saying how you have to fry the meat first on the bottom of the pot before you put in the tomatoes and this and that. This is the kind of stuff I've been hearing in the kitchen from my mother and my grandmother for all my life.
And a little bit of wine.
Little things like that, little touches. In other words, you didn't have to be an Italian-American to get off on that.
A little bit of sugar, and that's my trick.
One of the scenes that I remember is when De Niro comes home and he gets the apple for his wife with a piece of fruit. It's a pear. And the gift of this piece of fresh fruit for his wife is like, you know, that's like the blue bag of a Tiffany. She just lights up. And that scene seems like a memory. De Niro is your grandfather. You want to think your grandfather brought your grandmother a piece of fruit. And in that sequence where you see Pacino put on the mantle of the family. I mean, again, it's a memory.
They don't say if he's dead or alive.
My father was a very powerful man physically. My father was a very powerful man physically. And when my father was dying of cancer, that was the horror of it, was you go, that's not my dad. This man who's so feeble and so weak and so enervated.
Long Beach 4, 5, 6.
And from the moment he comes in, he becomes who he becomes.
Nurse, wait a minute. Stay here.
He realizes, this is my destiny. You shot my father. I'm gonna kill every motherfucking one of you fucking people. You know, if it means my own life, if it means my own life, you know, and all these passions I'm talking about, this is what the movie stirs up in you.
This is a film that improves every time you see it. I thought it was terrific when I first saw it, you know, but every time I saw it again and again, I liked it more and more. There's a real richness, there's a real texture.
Ma tua famiglia, non tu puoi amare, non tu.
It's like a great novel that you can reread and you find other things and you've forgotten something and you notice things because you're at a different age in your life and different characters' dilemmas mean something different to you.
What was a huge change for me seeing The Godfather was the humanity and emotion.
Uncle Leon, I wish you would have let me know you were coming. I could have prepared something for you.
The most emotionally charged scenes in the movie obviously belong to the gangsters. And they have the same emotions that you and I would have.
Scenes like after they've fired into his house and he says,
"In my home!"
And there's this level of rage that is building inside of him.
In my bedroom where my wife sleeps!
There are these kind of psychotic break moments.
Where my children come and play with their toys.
Where you have the neurotic gangster, which I think totally leads to Tony Soprano.
Godfather really kind of set the tone for taking that kind of movie out of the the old days of, the old Paul Muni movies and Edward G. Robinson movies, and took it into a whole other kind of level of reality.
This is Al Capone. I just talked over your new brewery down at the Stockyards. What is this? Take a look and see what we got for you, Snorky. What are you talking about? You talking straight or I'll jam this phone down your throat.
Well, I remember how Italians were depicted on television, and even Chico Marx, who played an Italian who talked like this. And, I was Italian, and my relatives didn't talk like this.
Look at me. A man always got to know what he's got to know. I got the plenty, I got the house, I got the automobile, I got the nicer girl.
One thing about those early 30s movies was you always had to have a moral ending. So it was like if you had a guy who committed all these crimes, and what ends up happening, he gets shot up by like 18 million machine gun hits.
I mean, I guess the message of the movie was supposed to be is crime doesn't pay, but that's, you know, it had all these disclaimers and advisories about the blight of gangsters and organized crime.
You know, they had a distinctly American moralistic point of view about making them colorful, yes, attractive, yes, but reproachable and punishable.
Come on, get your hands behind your head.
The Godfather allowed for these things to be discussed in human terms and not moral terms only, or at least the moral palette became more ambiguous.
The story of the undertaker who had his daughter abused and beaten, that the court system and the police, nobody would do anything, and that you had to go to some honorable person like Don Corleone to get justice.
Take a hold of him.
Morally and ethically, it showed a world that was corrupted from the top down.
My father's no different than any other powerful man. Any man who's responsible for other people. Like a senator or a president.
You know how naive you sound.
Why?
Senators and presidents don't have men killed.
Who's being naive, Kay?
The elements that are put together are not calibrated the normal way, you know, where you see a side that is not corrupted and a side that is corrupted, and how ultimately the good guys win.
Senator, we're both part of the same hypocrisy.
I mean, since I've been a little kid, I've never trusted adults. I've never trusted authority. And this movie just fortifies that in a very grand operatic way that, you know, everywhere you look, there is corruption or corruptibility or the potential for it.
These people are working a system, and they're playing within a system which everybody is corrupt.
So let's just say that you'll pay me because it's in your interest to pay me. But I want your answer and the money by noon tomorrow.
When you think about it, it's a deeply cynical outlook on life. You know, that they love their families, they're loyal to. But in the end, what it is, it's about power.
You can have my answer now if you like. My offer is this. Nothing. Not even the fee for the gaming license, which I would appreciate if you would put up personally.
The metaphor was, you know, we're just like the government, we're just like these kings, and basically, you know, we do things the same way they do it, but we do it our way. I think people bought that hook, line, and sinker, you know, because they gave you enough of that other stuff to be like horrified, and then at the other time they did it and it was so, you know, delicate.
Leave the gun. Take the cannoli.
And it was, I would say, probably a romanticized version of that world. But that's what great art does. It condenses